to its list of highest risk programs across the federal government. Since 1990, the GAO high risk list has highlighted those government programs most in need of attention from Congress and the executive branch. The high risk list differs from most GAO reports because once a program is put on that list, it has to earn its way off. Sub-programs have been on the list since its inception, leading to some to draw the comparison to the 1977 Eagles hit, Hotel California, where you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. However, since 1990, 23 other programs have earned their way off the list, and so doing that have turned into models of how government should work and saving billions of dollars along the way. Today we'll talk about 3 more programs I expect to soon follow in those footsteps. Since 2011, the GAO has published 14 reports pertaining to education, energy, and healthcare programs that serve federally recognized Indian tribes and their members. Those reports contain 41 recommendations for improvements. 39 recommendations are still open. Failure to implement these recommendations has literally put people's health and safety at risk, which is precisely why these programs have been added. For example, the GAO discovered that the Department of Interior has failed to conduct annual health and safety inspections and make repairs at many of the 185 elementary and secondary schools under its purview. Also, for example, the GAO found that the Indian Health Service provides inadequate oversight of its hospitals and is unable to ensure that patients receive quality care. At a few locations, the situation has gotten so bad that the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services has cited the hospitals for putting patient health and safety in imminent jeopardy. This subcommittee has stepped up its efforts in recent years to improve the situation in Indian country, particularly in the very areas we hear about today. To some, the addition of these programs to the high-risk list may seem like a setback. But I see this as an opportunity, not only to raise awareness and support throughout Congress, but also to challenge this subcommittee and the new administration to provide the resources and the oversight to get these programs back on track. And the GAO has provided the roadmap to get there. Now, some of our colleagues in Congress have argued against funding programs with significant management problems. I certainly can sympathize and in some cases even agree. But in other cases, management problems are a function of limiting funding. We all know that it takes money to hire and retain good people. The programs we'll hear about today are challenged by both poor management and limited funding. Teasing these apart so that we can chart a responsible path forward is a challenge before us today. We're joined today by 3 members of the GAO leadership team who will testify about their important work. First up will be Melissa Emrey-Arras, Director of Education Workforce Income Security, who will discuss education. Next, we'll hear from Frank Rusco, Director of the National Resources Environment, who will discuss the BIA Energy Program. And last but not least, welcome Kathleen King, Director of Healthcare, to talk about Indian Health Service. We'll hear opening statements from each of you before turning to questions and discussion with members of this committee. Before we begin, though, I would allow me to first ask our distinguished ranking minority member, Ms. McCollum, for any opening remarks she may wish to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to join you in welcoming the panel to the subcommittee this afternoon, and fully would like to acknowledge your remarks and agree with them. It's essential that the federal government meet its trust responsibility to Native American Indians, and oversight of Indian programs is a very important piece to ensuring that these commitments are appropriately met. And I'm very pleased that the GAO has been closely investigating the numerous challenges, as the chair put, facing the delivery of health care and education, especially by the Bureau of Indian Education and the Health Services, who we just heard from. The management issues and lack of accountability are reoccurring themes, and GAO has really helped to document the need for reform. This critical need was amplified in February when GAO added the federal management of Indian programs to its high-risk list. something that was appropriate and long overdue, in my opinion. Just last week, this committee held 2 days of tribal public witness hearings. We listened and learned about the unthinkable hardships in Indian country, and we also heard the message loud and clear. More work is needed to be done to improve healthcare and education services. But it's very unfortunate that this administration has put forward a budget that cuts Indian programs. Indian Health Services is cut by $300 million, and the Bureau of Indian Education by $372 million. These cuts, in my opinion, are cruel and they're unnecessary, and if enacted, would jeopardize the health and wellness of our Indian brothers and sisters. So today's hearing, Mr. Chair, is very timely, and I think the GAO will continue to be an important resource and partner as we carry out our oversight role. The findings from your investigations that we're going to hear from help both agencies that this committee works with, and it'll help the committee to start fixing broken programs, or should I say, broken promises. I look forward to discussing the findings today. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the courtesy of an opening statement.
Thank you. We are going to recognize Ms. Emrey-Arras. Welcome back to the subcommittee, and thanks again for being here today. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Calvert, Ranking Member McCollum, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss a new area we added to our high-risk list this year, improving federal management of programs that serve tribes and their members. We added this area to our high-risk list this past February in response to serious problems in federal management and oversight of Indian education, energy, and healthcare programs, which were highlighted in several of our prior reports. There are nearly 40 recommendations from these prior reports that have not been implemented. Overall, our high-risk program has served to identify and help resolve serious weaknesses in areas that involve substantial resources and provide critical services to the public. In order for this area to be removed from our high-risk list, which is our ultimate goal here, Interior and HHS need to show improvement on 5 key elements. And we have a star here that demonstrates the 5 separate areas. Those are leadership commitment, having capacity to resolve risks, having an action plan, doing monitoring, and demonstrating progress. Since this is a new area, it does not have a star created yet for it. However, in our next high-risk report in 2019, we will have a star specific to this new area, which will show the actual status at that point in time and whether or not any progress has been made. I will now highlight some of the concerns we have with Indian education. In our high-risk report, we identified serious weaknesses in BIE's oversight of school spending. For example, in 2014, we found that BIE did not have written procedures and risk criteria to ensure that schools use federal funds to educate students. Further, we found that BIE staff lacked expertise and training to effectively oversee school spending. As a result, we found several instances of misused funds, including over $1 million for one school that was improperly transferred to offshore accounts. We also identified unsafe school conditions in our high-risk report. Specifically, in 2016, we found that deteriorating facilities and equipment contributed to unsafe conditions at BIE schools. At one school, we found 7 boilers that failed inspection because of safety hazards, such as elevated levels of carbon monoxide and a natural gas leak. And you can see the failed inspection tag there. Though they endangered student safety, most of the boilers were not repaired until 8 months after the inspection. In addition to our prior work, we also have 2 new reports for this subcommittee that are being released today that raise new concerns about safety inspections and school construction. In terms of safety inspections, we found that no office routinely monitors the quality of inspection reports, and we found that 28 of 50 inspection reports we looked at were incomplete, inaccurate, or unclear. For example, we found reports in which inspectors did not inspect all of the buildings. In one of the reports we reviewed, an inspector noted that he did not inspect a dorm because he didn't have the key. The head of the safety office told us that this is not a valid reason for not inspecting a building. We also found cases of inspectors incorrectly giving school officials a year to fix broken fire alarms instead of the required 24 hours. Additionally, inspectors submitted nearly a third of all inspection reports to schools late after Indian Affairs' required 30-day timeframe. Some reports were more than 4 months late. In response to our new findings, we are recommending today that Interior monitor the quality and timeliness of school inspection reports. In a separate report, also being released today for this subcommittee, we found significant problems with the school construction process. Specifically, we found that Interior has not consistently used accountability measures to ensure that construction projects are completed on time, within budget, and meet school needs. We found that of 49 recent projects, 16 were 3 or more years late, 1 was almost 10 years late, 10 were 20% or more over budget. Interior does not always use accountability measures such as warranties to have builders replace defective parts because project managers do not always understand how to use these measures. So the warranty provisions may be in the contracts, but they're not being employed. As a result, we are recommending today that Interior develop guidance to help staff learn how to use accountability measures in school construction projects. We plan to monitor Interior's efforts to address both our prior recommendations and the 12 new recommendations in today's reports. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Rusco.
Thank you, Chairman Calvert, Ranking Member McCollum, and members of the subcommittee. I'm also grateful to be here today to discuss BIA's management of its responsibilities regarding energy development on tribal and Indian lands. As you know, the United States has recognized the sovereign status of tribes and currently recognizes 567 tribes as distinct independent political communities that possess certain powers of sovereignty and self-government. In 2016, Congress found in the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act that through treaties, statutes, and historical relations with Indian tribes, the United States has undertaken a unique trust responsibility to protect and support Indian tribes and Indians. These fiduciary responsibilities reflect commitments made in treaties and agreements under which Indians surrendered claims to vast tracts of land to the benefit of the people of the United States. This history has established enduring and enforceable federal obligations to which the national honor has been committed. So I raise that just because I think context is important here, and I'm going to say a lot of things about the performance of the BIA in meeting its fiduciary responsibilities, and it's not meeting its fiduciary responsibilities very well. But I believe this context is essential in our work to keep an eye on that the high-risk area is about what the agencies are doing. And our efforts are to improve what the agencies do with the money they have. And having listened to the statements of the committee members in the last hearing, understand that that's not the whole story, but I want that context to be reflected in the work we do. I have 2 handouts that I want to talk about just briefly, and one of them is in the hearing statement. This one is, and the other one is not. So, you know, there's a lot of energy resources on Indian and tribal lands, and so the first handout that is a map of the United States of the lower 48, and it shows shale oil and gas resources and then where they intersect with tribal lands. And there's more than 20 tribes that have oil and gas resources, just shale oil and gas resources on their lands. And several of them have coal. And in addition, something that's not on the map is that more than 200 tribes have the capacity needed to create utility-scale renewable power generation. And, you know, this is important because, you know, federal funding is scarce. It always has been and always will be. And tribes that have made improvements often have done that by developing some kind of economic base. And these opportunities represent that. And so when I talk about how the agencies are not doing their jobs effectively enough to help tribes that choose to develop these resources, that's what's at stake. The tribe's ability to develop their own resources, their own economic base, in order to actually take over some of the responsibilities. And when they can do a better job, perhaps. So tribes and their members can determine how to use their energy resources, but many of those resources are held in trust or restricted status. And because of that, BIA must review and approve leases, permits, and other documents required for development. We've found many deficiencies in BIA's management of Indian resources in several areas. And before I get into a couple of examples, I'll say that we put the Interior's management of oil and gas development on federal lands on the high-risk list in 2011 because there were many of the same deficiencies we found. And we've seen since then a lot of progress. Interior has made a great deal of progress in resolving a lot of those recommendations that got them on the high-risk list. And I'd like to talk about some of those in this hearing because those are things that if the agency does these things, they can solve some of the problems, and they aren't all related to the budget. Well, they are related to the budget. Let me be specific. One of the biggest problems is a lack of the staff with the right skills in the right place at the right time to review permits and environmental assessments or do environmental assessments and to do the kinds of permitting, evaluation, realty to figure out who owns what resources. And we find that all over on federal land. So BLM has struggled with having the right staff with the right training. And the problem is they're competing for some of these positions with industry. So they're out there trying to hire petroleum engineers. And industry is going to pay $100,000 more a year. So what do you do and how do you fix that? Well, you know, government employment is not private employment. There are some benefits, so you have to do the best that you can with those. And Interior, since we put them on the high-risk list, has gone to OPM, and they've gotten special authority to pay more for key areas like petroleum engineers or natural resource experts who otherwise would not go and live at some small regional town, a town with small regional office, because where would their kids go to school? Where would their spouse find employment? But they've gone and they've gotten extra pay authority. They have used the tools that they did that through OPM. They also went to Congress and they asked for money to pay for more staff, and they got that for offshore staff, and they got some extra appropriations. They used that effectively. They hired more people, and they closed some of those gaps. And when they did that, we said, all right, you're showing leadership commitment. You're doing the things you can do. You're asking Congress for help when you need it. And so they're making progress on their star. And so there's I have every reason to believe that BIA, with the right leadership commitment, could do some of the same things. So I won't take up a huge amount of time with examples that we found, but I want to talk about one thing in particular, and that is in response to tribal requests for increased coordination across agencies. And if you look at the second handout, you can see there are 14 agencies and 22 activities that are related to energy, and that doesn't even include all the state agencies and bodies you have to deal with when you want to develop energy, and then there's the tribal government. So it's immensely more complex than even doing this on federal lands, which is more complex than doing it on private or state lands. And from a regulatory basis, it's a mess. And Interior has taken some initial steps to form a new office, the Indian Energy Service Center. This is a great idea. It's a great idea because where there is a complex regulatory framework, you really need experts in a centralized area who can resolve problems and give good advice to people who are trying to get things done. And I'll give you an example. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is the final permitting authority for interstate pipelines. And sometimes, depending on where you're going and what things you're crossing, whether you're crossing parks or water, navigable waters or whatever, you might be dealing with 13 other agencies. And FERC is a one-stop clearinghouse for information on how to get through that regulatory process. So if you're going to build a pipeline, you go to FERC first. You do a pre-application. They tell you you need to go here, and you need to do environmental assessments here. You need to go over here. You need to check the Fish and Wildlife Service. And not only that, but FERC coordinates with those agencies to make sure that those things are getting done. And in Indian country, an application can come to one of those resource agencies, and people, they just sit on it. And it takes forever to get things going. So this Indian Energy Service Center, if it's done correctly, could provide some of the solution. But the problem is, when they set it up, they didn't set it up to try to include all the agencies that are involved. So we recommended that they do coordinate with those, and they've taken steps to start to build some relationships and agreements. The last thing I will say about that, and then I'll conclude my statement, is that you know, to fully staff that body will, as they envision it with 48 FTEs, would take about twice what their appropriation has been in the last couple of years, and they've asked for twice what they got. And so it doesn't mean that they can't do good with what they have, but I think to get the most out of it, they're going to keep asking to fill these spots, and you know, what happens after that is none of my business. And happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for testimony. Ms. King.
Chairman Calvert, Representative McCollum, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today to talk about our work on the Indian Healthcare Service. And much of what I was going to say has already been said by you and members of the committee, so I'm going to abbreviate my remarks and just focus on a few key things. Since 2011, we've issued 11 reports on IHS. We've made a number of recommendations. Some of them have been implemented, but most have not. And we have 14 outstanding recommendations. Our reports have found serious shortcomings in the quality of care rendered at IHS facilities and a lack of oversight. What IHS does is it devolves a lot of responsibilities down to the area offices without national standards, and there's not a feedback loop coming back to headquarters for them to know what's going on. So they don't know what's going on with quality of care, and they also don't have any standards or way of knowing what's going on with regard to patient wait times for primary care. And you know, we think that's a real serious shortcoming, and that they should have national standards, and they should have a way of knowing what's going on out in the field, and not just leaving that there. We've also done some work on the PRC program, and found some shortcomings there as well. And there's a formula, a base formula for the PRC program that dates back to the 1930s. No one could tell us the origin of this formula, but it results in a lot of disparities across the areas, ranging from when we did our work to a low of $299 per capita to $801 per capita. This is inequitable because IHS could not say to us that there was differences among the areas in terms of health needs. We made a matter to Congress some years ago saying that Congress should direct the IHS to develop a more equitable formula for the PRC program, and legislation was introduced on that but not enacted. So that's a key factor. The IHS did adopt another one of our recommendations, which we thought was very significant. Under the PRC program, it used to be that they paid physicians and other non-hospital providers what they charged. In some cases, they had negotiated contracts or had discounted rates, but in most places they were paying what physicians charge. And that's not typical in the health insurance industry. We made a recommendation that they reduce the payments to the same as Medicare paid, and they did adopt that. And as part of that, we estimated that they would save $32 million. So that was a positive step. We've also made a number of recommendations to improve the management of the PRC program and to encourage IHS to expand their outreach efforts to get people enrolled in other third-party insurance such as Medicaid. Because when people enroll in that insurance, two good things can happen for IHS. One, if they seek care at an IHS facility, IHS can bill for that revenue and keep it, and that enhances their PRC revenue. Or if someone takes their Medicaid or other insurance and goes elsewhere and gets care, that reduces the demand on IHS. So, that's another important step. With that, I think I'll stop because I know you'll have questions for us.
Well, thank you for all of your testimony. It's obviously extremely concerning what's going on out there, and we'll have a number of questions for the record, but I'll lead off with a couple of questions that seem to be appropriate. I think I'll start with you, Melissa. What changed from 2015 to 2017 that prompted GAO to add tribal programs to the list?
I think the number of reports that we had during that time frame and the significance of those findings really caused concerns for us and made us realize that this was really a high-risk issue. And it didn't help that there were so many open recommendations that hadn't been resolved.
Right. How frequently does GAO meet with the agencies to monitor progress? Maybe all of you could probably answer that.
We talk with the agencies regularly about the recommendations and the like. I would say at a minimum, at least every 6 months, but it's frequently quite often more than that. We often talk with them in the course of our ongoing studies as well.
In addition to that, being on the high-risk list means that there will be a meeting with OMB, the Secretary of the Interior, the deputy secretaries, and all the assistant secretaries of the relevant bureaus. And in that, we will talk about where they are in high risk, and they'll talk about what they're doing to get off it, and the OMB will be there to try to add some accountability. So that also happens.
When asked, does the GAO provide any help? Do you guys provide any help if some of these agencies ask for help?
Well, so we provide our recommendations, and we'll clarify what we mean if asked, but we can't really tell them in detail how to resolve problems and then come back later and audit them and say whether they're doing a good job. So we're careful about that.
Yeah. You know, you had a couple of these charts up that this one, looked like. I was going to. It looks like Obamacare, doesn't it? Oh, no, I'm just. Oh. But anyway, this is an extremely complicated chart. How do you explain that? I mean, obviously, there has to be some efficiencies here to fix that. How do you, so you don't give any advice, but where do they go to? I mean, this has got to be cleaned up. So who do they work with to do that?
Yeah, this is a case where I think there's two things. We need to look further into that, and see where there might be efficiencies and it's specifically where their coordination could resolve a problem or where there's maybe multiple agencies doing something. But I'll give you one example. There are two energy loan guarantee programs, and one's in Interior and one's in DOE. DOE has never been funded, but Interior is funded. DOE has loan programs. They have all the expertise to run loan programs, and we haven't looked at the Interior's loan programs, but I've looked at DOE's loan programs since their inception in 2005, and it took them forever to get up to speed. And when they finally did, they have a solid group of professionals who can evaluate loans and make them. But that took years to do. And so one of the things that we would look at is, do you really need two, energy loan guarantee programs? Or could you use the resources from one and save some money that money could go to increasing the amount of loans? Because honestly, the annual amount in the Indian energy loan guarantee program, that would fund one large energy project. And so, you could use all the money you can get. And so we haven't looked at that, so that's not a recommendation, but that's the kind of place we would look. We would look for that sort of
This
efficiency.
goes to management, and that goes to leadership and finding somebody that can, maybe outside, to look at this entire process and improve upon it. One last question. $1 million to an offshore account? Explain that.
Sure. It actually happened in 11 separate transactions, and it went to 3 Asian countries, but primarily Indonesia, and they were not able to recover the money.
And who did this?
The thought was that it might have been some kind of hacking or cyber, crime. However, the bank accused the school of not having properly secure computers to do these transactions, and so the account was compromised.
So nobody
Nobody was held. Yeah, nobody was arrested in the end. The money was not returned. And we have a concern because there's limited funding, as we've been talking about, and you want to make sure that the funding that is provided goes to schools and is not diverted. And because of that, we made recommendations to better oversee school spending to guard against those kinds of problems. Actually, in 2014, we made recommendations to have basic RIN procedures to oversee school funding to make sure it's being spent appropriately, and that has yet to happen.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
can you yield for a second?
sure.
Does not the FBI or other law enforcement agencies assist you in these recovery of such funds? I mean, if it was taken from a bank account, obviously it had to be transferred to some other account.
The FBI was brought in by the Interior's IG office to look into this, but they were not able to identify the individuals or obtain the money in the end.
Amazing. Ms. McCollum?
Thank you very much for your testimony, and thank you for working with the agencies, because I think the Indian programs within the Department of Interior, these are people who get up every morning and want to do the best job that they can. And one of the things that's becoming very apparent, besides facility maintenance and backlog, to me, is staffing. I'm just going to kind of roll a couple things out and then have you all respond. So one of the things that became very clear in one of the reports that we received on the inspection for schools is, you have one person maybe who works in the agency. They have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles to cover, and they have multiple hats to wear, and they really haven't gone to school to become a really good inspector of buildings, and then that becomes their job. Or we have things that are contracted out, but we don't have the personnel in place to kind of do a double check of what's happening with the contractor. And then your point about warranties, I worked in the private sector for years. I worked for a major retailer. And I dealt with carpet warranties and furniture warranties. And I'll tell you, it's a full-time job, and you have to be on it 24/7. And here again, if you don't have the school maintenance person in Indian country really knowing how to deal with some of these warranty issues, they can be very difficult to resolve. So some of this is staffing and training. So that I point out in education a little bit. Staffing and training, and what you were saying just in energy, Mr. Russo, with just trying to get people to stay and be retained in it, as well as understanding all the quagmire from who to report to who. So it seemed to me that there's state models out there. You mentioned FERC. There's models out there that maybe Indian country can, look or work or sit down and have a roundtable with the agencies on how to streamline and move forward on that. So, having timely inspections and permits and everything are very, very important, but there's some things that are going to be going on in the EPA budget with doing permits and timely inspections and that, and I don't know if there's something I'm going to follow up to see if there's something I should be watching in that budget, because I don't really, they're up there and I'm kind of concerned about their permitting. And then, Ms. King, I'm going to end with this. They have been given a directive at Indian Health Services and Indian Education and all the rest to reduce staffing when they have huge gaps, holes, not enough physicians in Indian Health Service, problems retaining and recruiting people. Is part of your recommendations to beef up and get the right people doing the right kind of staffing and figure out how to retain it? Because I quite frankly think I need to write a letter to the White House saying, in this particular area, to ask people to be doing a workforce reduction is pound foolish.
During the course of our work, IHS has told us that not having the right staff is one of the key impediments to quality of care and access to timely primary care. And some of our work really documented the change in leadership in the area offices and in key positions. And we also have some ongoing work now where we're looking at staffing issues, and we hope to have some constructive advice that comes out of that, creative solutions or things that they can do. But certainly having the staff, especially the medical staff, in these facilities is important.
I would add on the education front, we have similar concerns in terms of workforce planning. We have 2 outstanding recommendations regarding workforce planning to make sure that they have the right staff in the right locations to do the work. We had people telling us that they were not accountants, they didn't know how to review single audits, and yet that was their job. So that was a concern of ours. In terms of the training issue that you brought up and inspections, in the report that is released today, we found that 33 out of 39 staff with safety responsibilities did not complete required training. So they're not even doing the training that's provided by the agency and required by the agency.
But how many of those individuals, that wasn't their only job? I mean, that's part of my point here is not to if there's federal employees not doing their job, they need to be held accountable to it. But sometimes we're asking the same federal employee in some of these, the Bureau of whether it's Indian Health or Indian Education to do multiple jobs. I mean, we're asking these people to perform superhumanly. So is that part of your report too?
That does cover individuals who may have responsibilities in addition to safety issues.
With respect to the energy side, there are other examples of agencies doing more by being more with less by being creative. So BLM has repeatedly, because of the boom and bust nature of oil and gas, they've repeatedly been sort of misstaffed in regional offices. So when the shale boom came, all of a sudden they don't have anybody in North Dakota. They have tons of people in Wyoming. Shale gas just drove coal bed methane gas out of business, and so all of a sudden Wyoming has people in BLM offices with nothing to do. North Dakota doesn't have people, and they have all these permits and all this inspections to do. And so they implemented a pilot program to try to move people into hot spots and take care of business. And we have not looked at that closely enough, and we've looked at it. It was a very successful pilot. They should continue that, and I think BIA can learn from that. But we haven't looked specifically at BIA to see how well that centralized model where you have people that can go for a specific time and take care of a workload problem. But I think that's a very promising potential.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. Could you put the star back up? I know it's there somewhere. You don't want the yellow tag? No, I've seen the yellow tag. I can't. Did they use that school for the 8 months that they had the yellow tags up?
Yes, and there were students involved.
That's amazing. As I read your report last night, and I did read all of it. That was an amazing accomplishment, I think. The one thing that came to my mind as I read in all three of these areas, and it seemed like there was one common theme of this star, and that's leadership commitment. And if you look at the incredible turnover within these agencies, whether it's at the local level, mid-local level, even in Washington, D.C., has anybody looked at why is there such a huge turnover in these programs of leadership, and how do you keep a leadership commitment that's continually turning over?
In terms of BIE issues, we have reported on the significant turnover and cited that as a management challenge. As many of you know, the prior director of BIE was removed from his position last year due to ethics concerns.
So Interior faced this when they were on the high risk, are on the high risk list for oil and gas management and federal lands. We think that they have largely solved that leadership issue with one bureau's exception. But they did it by institutionalizing the ownership of the issues. So they said, all right, this is your position. You own these issues. You own these recommendations. And once that's institutionalized and that's part of your job description, if you have turnover, that's still part of your job description. And that's not it won't solve everything. It won't solve bad acting, but if you get somebody who's got a job and here's a description and it's written into it that this is what you do, then I think that's how they've dealt with it. And they have a lot of turnover too, but they've been making great progress.
Go ahead.
With respect to IHS, I think they've been without permanent leadership for about 2 years. They had an acting director, I believe, for about the last year of the Obama administration, and there are no, as we saw today, no permanent people in place yet in this administration. So that's a long time with temporary leadership. And the other thing that we saw in the area offices, when there was a problem in one area, they'd move people around to go to that area to fix the problem there, to fix the crisis. But results in a big churn among the area offices, which is...
Have we ever gone out and asked people that left why they left? What's driving them to leave that field and go into something else? What's the cause of the turnover? I mean, we have talked on this committee with people who worked in or ran IHS just to get background information, and the stories we've heard, that used to work there years ago and that kind of stuff. Anybody gone out and done that?
I have not.
No.
No.
Well, it'd be interesting to find out what it is. I suspect that agencies look at, not entirely, but, my wife often makes recommendations of things that I should do that I don't think are in my best interest. Sometimes agencies might look at you that way, that you are the data geeks and all that kind of stuff, and so you make all these recommendations of stuff. Do they ever look at you and say, that's neat on paper, but it's not the real world that we live in and try to deal with every day? Consequently, we're not going to implement that, and that's why 39 of the 41 or whatever it is recommendations haven't been implemented. How do you work that out between agencies to try to implement your recommendations?
Well, so we try very hard not to make recommendations that we haven't got really good ideas are implementable, and we do that by getting past the leadership and onto the ground and find out, like, a lot of our recommendations come from the agency. We talk to them, they tell us what's wrong with it. It's amazing how much they admit when you go out on the field and talk to people. They know where their problems are, and they're trying to solve them too, but it gets back to the leadership issue. And so it goes all the way to the Secretary of Interior. If the Secretary of Interior does not put in the budget, I need more resources for Indian programs, well, then where do you go? I mean, and obviously it's up to OMB too, right? You know how it works a lot better than I do.
Fortunately,
And so, that leadership it has to come from the top. It has to go down to the bureaus, and then the bureaus have to institutionalize the ownership of the problem, and then you've got a commitment, and that's when you can see progress, at least in my experience with.
Well, if that leadership isn't coming from the top, or hasn't come from the top, or I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody, but if it doesn't come from the top, what can this committee do? Can we write into legislation, into our bill, some of these recommendations and require the agencies to do some of those things that need to be done?
Yes.
Would you recommend that we do some of those things that maybe are the harder ones to get done, or that get more resistance?
Yes. I think simple things like having written procedures to oversee school spending should be done immediately, not languish for years.
I think things like hearings too are helpful, because what I find in our areas, occasionally IHS has disagreed with us and said, nope, we're not going to implement that recommendation, but more frequently they agree but they don't do it.
No. One more thing, since I chair the Energy and Water Appropriation Committee, we will look at the possibility of including the Indian Loan Guarantee program under the direction of the DOE Loan Guarantee Program. I know that Secretary Moniz recommended some of that type of thing in the last budget. We just didn't feel we had the money to do it, or didn't feel confident of what they were trying to do. So, but I think that's a valid recommendation. There's one thing I will say, though. Kathleen, you mentioned that one of the recommendations that had just been implemented by one of the programs was that they pay the Medicare rate to doctors instead of the rate that doctors were charging. Has anybody followed that up to see what the accessibility to doctors has been? Has that decreased accessibility? And the reason I asked that, I was a dentist in the real world, and while I'm not talking about Medicare, I was talking about, I will tell you that if somebody said, we're only going to pay the Medicaid rate, which is what dentists usually deal with, if I only operated on Medicaid patients, I'd be out of business.
We actually
Covered the costs. So, I mean, you have to look at accessibility, too.
We actually did some sounding out on that before we made that recommendation, and we asked a number of providers, what do you think about this? And some people said, IHS should have done this a long time ago. The rates that are being paid are too high. But we did make a recommendation to IHS to follow up and make sure that access is maintained, because that's an important aspect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pingree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the work you've been doing and for your testimony. It's been very educational and much appreciated to hear the work that you're doing, and I'm sure where we can yield some improvements, it'll be good. I don't have a lot of questions or comments to make. Certainly some of the concerns about Indian health and Indian education have been problems in our state. We don't have a drop of energy besides wind in our state, and that's not on your list. And I will just add that in terms of education, we have been concerned about the role that the BIA plays in Bureau of Indian Education. We have one facility in the pipeline in our state, and the committee's been very helpful with that, the Beatrice Rafferty School, which is a Passamaquoddy school. It's taken us 3 years to get from the design stage to the construction stage, and it still doesn't look like there'll be a groundbreaking till 2019. And in any other circumstance in school construction, it wouldn't look like that. And every time there's been a hitch, and we've followed up and tried to figure it out, it's been bureaucratic, intractable. It just doesn't make any sense, even when there are differences in the rules or everything else. You're just thinking, like, Does everybody put a roadblock everywhere they can to keep this from happening? And this is a school that was funded. But, you know, funding delays cost money, and little glitches all of a sudden result in more money because somebody interprets one thing one way. You look like you might have a comment.
I would just say that the report that we're releasing today does get to that issue of construction delays, and one of the things that we heard repeatedly was that Interior was not providing enough technical assistance and oversight to tribes on construction projects, and that they were not responding in a timely way to requests, which was resulting in extensive delays.
Yeah, and so we'll look forward to reading the report, but that was what we've experienced from observing this process. And as with most schools, and everyone on this committee knows it better than me, these are already schools generally that are condemned, that have you know, unhealthy conditions, uninspected boilers, mold, all kinds of other problems already. So when it takes long delays, you've just got students locked in places that they shouldn't be, and teachers trying to teach under inadequate situations, and you know, communities feeling really bad about the situation, which leads to all other kinds of health complications and, you know, suicide rates and all kinds of other things when you're compounding problems, especially starting with kids. So thank you for your work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Joyce?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And following along those lines, it seems like there was an 8-month interval between the initial finding of the problem and anything being done. Can you explain why there was such a delay?
I don't know why there was a delay, but this is not unusual. There are frequently issues where hazards are identified and they're not remediated. And in our prior work, we found that it was so extensive that it was not uncommon to have the next year's inspection find the same problems as in the previous year's inspection. We did make a recommendation for Interior to provide assistance to schools to be able to actually fix the problems and help them build capacity so that they know how to do that, but that recommendation remains unimplemented.
But the funding exists for it. There's just a failure to do so at the local or at that one individual level. And is this occurring at other schools?
It's occurring at multiple schools in terms of identified problems that have not been fixed and remain for years. And in terms of the issues there, I think one of the issues is having staff at the school level who know how to read an inspection report, who know what to do to correct the problem. You may have janitorial staff, for example, responsible, and they may not know exactly what to do in terms of certain repairs. And we think it's critical that Interior provide that technical assistance to schools so that they can address safety concerns versus having concerns repeat from year to year or last 8 months in this situation.
Absolutely.
Something like that occurs where you have a boiler, which obviously, if it's a malfunction, could blow up and kill a number of people. Why wasn't that school immediately closed until that problem was fixed? Don't they have the authority to close that school, or doesn't anybody have the common sense to understand that?
We had the same concern. It was unfathomable to us that that boiler remained in that condition with those gas leaks while students and staff were in the area.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
On that, so was that the yellow tag school? Because it usually, I mean, there's a big difference between a yellow tag and a red tag, and I'm not trying to pretend to be a plumber or a pipe fitter here, but having kind of dealt with this a little bit in real life, I mean, that's a yellow tag. So usually with the yellow tag, you get like, okay, we're not going to shut you down. It's not immediate, but you have to get it repaired within X number of hours, and they have a responsibility, the plumbing company or whatever, and maybe all states aren't created equal. Maybe it gets into state jurisdiction, to be back in 48 hours or 24 hours to make sure that it's correct. In other words, we can fix this. It can be fixed properly. It'll be fixed expeditiously. That, you know, it sounds from, if this is a school, I mean, it seems to me whoever put the yellow tag on it put the wrong color on, and the school should have been closed.
That's possible. You can see that the sign says, I think, that the carbon monoxide's too high on the tag. That's another issue in terms of the inspections, is that They're not always done in an accurate way, as evidenced by some of our findings in terms of broken fire alarms and the like. People were told that they had a year to fix things when they should have been fixed within 24 hours. So there's often an issue in terms of the directions that are provided by the inspector.
But that's not the school that puts that tag on it, or the janitor. That's usually, that's somebody whose license is on the line.
That is an outside inspector, that's correct.
Mr. Joyce?
And I'm sorry, but I don't find it humorous. I mean, I think that on top of the explosion factor, on top of the carbon monoxide factor, people are going to die. And so I don't get the disconnect between you write a report that says these things need to be fixed and nothing happens. There has to be some other agency or somebody who's going to step in because you're putting all these kids' lives at risk.
We have a similar concern. We think that things need to change. We've made recommendations, and that's partly why we've put this issue on the high-risk list.
Again, it's a list. I mean, there has to be some type of, I don't care what the local authorities are, whether it's, you have a theft of $1 million and it's a theft of $1 million. I don't know, 25 years as a prosecutor, that galls me. And the fact that you put in things like this, I used to represent school districts, you put in something like this and nobody does anything about it, this can't go on.
They did put that on.
Well, I appreciate that, but I mean, you find people who are doing this. I mean, somewhere, where's this disconnect? We got to find out where it is and fix it. I'm sorry.
We share your concern.
Well, we have a hard stop here at 3:30, and it's 3:35, but I certainly appreciate this panel. I have some additional questions I'll be submitting to you.
Happy to answer them.
And in writing, so we'll do that. But we certainly appreciate your coming today.
Thank you for having us.
Appreciate your testimony and your truthful answers, and we are adjourned.
Thank you all.